The Opel GT is an unusual and misunderstood little sports car. It is a German car made under General Motors by Opel. It was partially built in France, completed in Germany, and shipped to many countries around the world in small quantities. Roughly two-thirds of the 103,463 Opel GTs ended up in the US, where GM, in their infinite wisdom, sold them at Buick dealers. At that time, Buick had many ads that seemed to target younger generations than the typical Buick owners. I think GM hoped that the small, sporty Opels would help redefine Buick's image. The history of the Opel GT goes back to the early 60s. In 1962, the first design sketches began moving around Opel. The sketches showed a modern wedge-shaped front end with some Pontiac Banshee-type design cues. GM fans may know the name Claire Mackinchan, who was the head designer at Chevy from 1952 until he moved to the head designer at Opel in 1962. Claire Mackinchan and Erhard Schnell, who is known as the father of the GT, brought the Opel GT concept car into worldwide fame in 1965. This is where the misconception that the GT is designed after the Corvette C3 falls apart. The designers hid the GT from GM up until right before they unveiled the concept to the public. They likely didn't want GM to hear about the design because they may have said no. I guess their strategy was to ask for forgiveness later if it didn't work. The C3 was being developed at the exact same time, in secret, and there was no communication between the different GM design groups at that time. This was at a time before internet and before networking between the offices. Luckily, the GT was a hit at the Frankfurt Motor Show. GM had no choice but to encourage Opel to move forward with designing the production version. Their goal was a true sports car for less than 10,000 marks or 3,000 US dollars. This was a very difficult goal to achieve, and Opel unfortunately had to make many compromises and fight GM for many of the features that made it through to the final product. The worst compromise was probably the suspension. The GT had to use the suspension from the Opel Kadett, a compact, economical car lovingly known as the Mini Brute. In other words, the GT suspension isn't exactly sporty. Opel did manage to keep many positives, though. Time trials at the Nürburgring convinced the higher-ups that the engine needed to be moved back considerably from the stock position from the Kadett. It also maintained its lightweight and aerodynamic steel unibody. This all contributed to a weight distribution of about 54 to 46, which can be better improved by moving the battery from the front of the car to the rear of the car. The final product ended up being a base model with a 1.1-liter overhead valve engine that was lovingly referred to as the sewing machine in Germany. For just a very small upcharge, you could upgrade to an Opel GT Luxus, which had a 1.9-liter CIH, or cam and head, engine. On the VIN tag, these models say Opel GT/AL, which stands for that it is the Luxus edition. However, no one ever says Luxus. In Europe, there is another model, GT/J. That stands for GT Junior, and it is essentially a dechromed Opel GT Luxus. So it has a 1.9-liter engine, but all the chrome bits are painted black. There are also a number of other small changes that made this car more affordable. This was likely a replacement for the failed 1.1-liter GT. 1968 was the first year of production. These handful of GTs were hand-built, and they were very fast due to the use of a much higher compressor head than any of the other Opel models. Sadly, only about 540 1968 GTs were made, and almost none of them came to the US. In 1969 through 1970, Opel sold many 1.9-liter GTs around the world. The 1.1-liter was discontinued in 1970 due to poor sales. Only about 3,400 were made, making it the rarest model of Opel GT. In 1971 through 1973, the GT sales began dropping, and EPA guidelines forced Opel to reduce the compression of the US versions, making them even more underpowered. The 1973 was the last year for the GT. Plummeting sales combined with the new US guidelines for crash-resistant bumpers killed it. Opel did design studies with the crash-resistant bumpers, but they simply looked horrible. So enough about the history, let's get into the specs and the review of the GT. I already mentioned the GTs had a 1.9-liter CIH, or cam and head engine. This is a unique engine design that Opel used until the mid-90s in many of their cars. Cam and head is a sort of hybrid between an overhead cam and an overhead valve engine. The cam is literally central in the head, with lifters riding directly on top of it to operate the rockers and valves. This design allows for more compactness, high revving, and more rotational efficiency than an overhead valve engine. But it's not as good as an overhead cam engine in those same aspects. In the GT, the cast iron engine was known to be really reliable if treated right. There are some problems with overheating in warmer states of the US, and the 1972 and 73 heads have a tendency to crack due to overheating with the slight design change in those heads. Opel claimed the GT made 102 horsepower at the crank, but this is before standardized horsepower testing methods were established. They likely ran the engine with no belts and tons of advance to get that number. 85 to 90 horsepower at the crank is probably closer to the SAE value for the high compression engines. The post-1970 engines, well, you might be looking at the high 70 horsepower range for those engines. The interior has to be one of the best things about the GT. It is well equipped with a tach, a speedo, amp gauge, oil pressure gauge, engine temperature, fuel level, clock, radio, and a bunch of warning lights. There are also switches for heater, parking lights, and an optional rear window defroster, and even a brake test switch with a warning light. The gauges are all nicely angled towards the driver, and the low reclined seating position gives a feeling of flying an airplane. My GT has a dealer-installed AC that nicely houses the 4-speed shifter, headlight lever, and parking brake. Behind the seats is a nice storage area that, in my opinion, makes up for the lack of a trunk. The full-size spare tire and tools are located behind a vertical flap in the rear of the interior. The wiring on a GT is actually really nicely done from the factory, and often much of it can be saved without any headache. However, every GT owner has to pay careful attention to the wiring that goes to the headlights. As you would imagine, the twisting motion caused by the headlights will damage the wiring over time. The exterior of the car has a nice chrome trim and sweeping Coke bottle-shaped curves. This car was the most aerodynamic car made by GM in the 60s. Combined with the wonderful rattle-free unibody construction, this lightweight car was able to reach speeds of over 115 miles per hour and would likely keep going if it had another gear. Unfortunately, the car has negative downforce at the front and rear at those speeds, and going much faster than 120, which is my highest, would be a very bad idea. I could go on and on about the exterior styling, but I'll let you decide for yourself. Be sure to notice the vents in the hood bump for the carburetor, and the interesting cabin ventilation exits above the rear window. Under the hood of my GT is a bored-out stock GT engine with 2 liters of displacement and mostly period-correct modifications. It has a Weber 40 DCOE side-draft carburetor instead of the stock Solex downdraft, or the most commonly seen Weber downdraft upgrade. My engine makes around 110 horsepower at the crank now, plus or minus 5. GT engines have a lot of 3,000 RPM torque and really good throttle response. The weakest point of the engine, and the reason why many of these cars aren't driven, is the huge effect vacuum leaks have on running. Even the tiniest vacuum leak can lead to days of frustration for new owners and veteran Opel owners alike. Overheating and vapor lock are also problems, but can easily be fixed by repairing the cooling system, rerouting the fuel line, replacing the underhood rubber seals, and in places like Arizona where it gets really hot, it's advisable to install an electric cooling fan. Power is transferred through a tiny 4-speed manual transmission or a less common automatic transmission. There is a short drive shaft that connects to the torque tube before reaching the live axle rear end. The rear end has coil springs, panhard rod, and trailing arms, but US GTs are stupidly missing the rear anti-sway bars. If you buy a GT, be sure to add one of the available front and rear anti-sway bars so they'll handle like their German counterparts. The front suspension is a unique design that is okay, but not great. It has a transverse leaf spring. It's also not known for its strength. Bent control arms are a common sight, but strengthening gussets are available. In my opinion, the steering makes up for the subpar front end. It is a rack and pinion design, and it has a very sporty ratio. The headlights are everybody's favorite thing in this car. They flip over using the large mechanical lever inside the car. The operation is pretty cleverly engineered. I'll provide a link to a video about the headlight design in the description if you'd like to see. My GT has always been a very reliable car. It has never left me stranded in the 12,000 miles that I've driven it. It always starts easily and is happy in any driving conditions. The road feels phenomenal even before putting on the sway bars, but it did have significant body roll. After installing sway bars, a lowering spring, and poly bushings, it feels like a true sports car, or at least a really good go-kart. There are no rattles inside due to the unibody construction, but it is a painfully noisy car in terms of engine noise. Luckily, the exhaust note makes up for the rather tractor-sounding engine. The well-designed cabin ventilation is amazing. Air comes through the floor vents and dash vents and escapes through the rear of the car near the rear windshield. It is pretty easy to stay cool as long as you are moving. Even in its stock form, the GT has plenty of power to pass, but you won't be winning any races. Upgraded GTs like mine can keep up with some 90s sports cars and even outrun a few first-gen Miatas as long as the road is straight. The GT is not a car for everyone, but it is a gorgeous sports car that can make you smile at every curve with a little bit of tuning. Parts are readily available for cheap from several sources, including Opel GT Source. Most repairs are very easy on the GT, but it is always a good idea to look on the Opel GT forum for tips. The main thing to watch out for is rust. The steel unibody makes it very difficult to fix rust, and rust is sometimes dangerous to ignore. Spending money on a rust-free example will be much cheaper in the long run. With proper maintenance, a running GT can take you many miles in style.